Good morning. Welcome to Urban Sanctuary Sunday Gathering Time. And my guest today is David Bell of the Yakama Christian Mission. So David and I met at the NBA's anti-racist training in Kansas City, and I was just really moved by his leadership of that event. So to start out with, let me ask you, tell us something about your name, David Bell, and the name of this place where you belong and you work there, the Yakama Christian Mission. What's in those names, and how did the two of you come together?
Right. Interesting question. I've never been asked it quite in that way before. But there is a tie that I find to be interesting. My folks, you know, my parents are out of West Texas, and their folks are from that area as well. But the family keeps moving back to the east, and prior to the Revolutionary War, folks came here prior to the Revolutionary War, but primarily from Scotland and Ireland. And here's what I find interesting is that the Bells were part of the Scottish folks who were planted into Ireland to change the people there, to move them away. I mean, folks had already been moved from their indigeneity to Catholicism. And then England wants to get them moved from Catholicism to Protestantism. And so the Bells are planted there, which in Northern Ireland, you know, has led to what there is, you know, today, and for many of us who know that history. But in turn, that whole idea of plantation turned around, and you ended up with Bells ending up into North Carolina, and being planted again to move a very particular idea, theology, empire structure, and in that, ultimately, long before I came to the Yakama Mission, but the base of the Yakama Mission was to come in. Yakama Mission got started in 1921 formally, but this was disciples' way of coming in and to specifically come to the people, to the Yakama people, to Christianize and to civilize. And so I find myself here and going, this piece of white supremacy and racism, in one way or another, has been a part of my family and my relationship with Indigenous people for generations, for hundreds of years. Yeah, it's an oddball, interesting, lying on the edge of evil tie, that you might say.
Wow. So related to that, then, now the way that you're working there, and the commitment that the disciples of Christ have, and the vision they have for the work there. I mean, one of the big things I understand that you do and would normally be doing in the summer is this summer learning experience for people to come and understand this history and the issues that you're talking about. So when people come to be part of that summer learning experience, what's different when they leave, and how they experience that?
Right. Core to it is that it's specifically not set up to be a mission trip. When groups are here, we try to spend a fair amount of time talking about racial and gender and sexual identity, the justices that are around that, as well as of heritage, ethnicity, and the justice that lies in there. And foundational to all of that is economic justice, because that plays out in a very particular way in the United States, and that there's no justice without really direct a heavy conversation on that. So that's always a That's always an interesting conversation. Folks really have a lot of time on that one. But core to each one of those is getting to a place of understanding that of the need to be tied to creation. And how when we miss that tie and lose that, then we lose a lot of our own identity.
Wow. And so one of the things that you teach a lot about, that you shared some with me, is about this the doctrine of discovery. And I have shared that some information about that with the congregation prior to this conversation we're having, David. But when we learn about the doctrine of discovery and how it completely shaped the early colonization of this country, it's easy for us to hear those things and just feel appalled and say, oh yeah, but we're not like that now. But are we? Are we not? Are we like that or not? What's left?
Right. I would say the answer is yes. And we can't help but be, because this has become embedded within our structure. So it's kind of like talking about racism. When we talk about racism, are there individual racists? Well, certainly there are. But what's so much more evil is that institutional, structural, systemic racism that becomes a part of the air that you breathe. It's just naturally becomes a part of what's in your education. That's the doctrine of discovery. To understand, for instance, racism and white supremacy in the United States today is to understand what is its roots. And its roots are in the doctrine of discovery. And so when you understand the doctrine of discovery as something that builds up nations and business that serve one another, then you can start looking around today and go, where does business and state, through a taxation system, the system of taxes, how does that play out in a way that hurts people? Mm. And so a very simple one for me would be the private prison industry. Is that here's an industry that gains by the imprisonment of people. Mm. And when we look at it in that way, then we know the prison industry, as long as we can bring people in, we make money, we pay taxes to the state has, the coffers get larger, and so you create this circular piece that says it's good to have people in prison. And who gets hit at that? Who gets hit the worst with that? Well, statistically, Indians are the highest. Native Americans, American Indians, whatever phrase you want to use, to population, they're at the highest. And then the next highest is African Americans. And then you just move through your folks of color. So you continue a slave industry today without giving it any thought. And that's what the doctrine of discovery is about.
The trauma that's carried from all that. So how does that, I mean, you've talked some about what that's like in the spirits of the people who live there. And do you have a sense of how the healing begins to happen from all of these centuries of trauma that are kind of in the spiritual DNA of this trauma? How does the healing start to happen now?
Right. It's a really good question. I think that's, for me, that's really hard to answer. Because what I'm going to say is relationship, and yet that sounds way too simplistic, and it is in many ways. It's how do we lie in the midst of this as people of color, Native Americans, and non-natives, and white people who have all been damaged by this in one way or another. Everybody whose identities have been misaligned through this. How do we get on the other side of that? And I think it's extremely hard. And I don't think that we've got I don't think we've started well yet. And part of that is because the system is so much a part of who we are. So when I talk about economic justice, is that when we understand the doctrine of discovery and racism is based in the use of money and taxes and profit, and we understand that our jobs and the way we pay for our food and our housing and our health care is dependent on that economic system, to get on the other side of trauma is incredibly hard. And so I do think that it lies in people developing relationships with one another. And they need to be strong relationships that of where folks are comfortable having conversations with one another. So that for me, if we're not regularly inviting our friends of color over to have conversations on this, we're missing out. And if we're folks of color, we're inviting our white friends over to have conversations on this, we're missing out. We need to develop the wherewithal, the spiritual base to be able to know that at our core, we are creation and we are not different from one another, and we are not different from the rest of creation. And so all of that stuff that's out there, that's economic based, that doctrine of discovery based, that's racism based, is all of that evil that's out there is not who we are. That at our core, we are deeper and more meaningful than that.
We've been having that conversation a lot in our congregation as well about how, I mean, we have some time to reflect on it right now because it's not easy to get together, but it's time for us to, you know, realize that when we reboot, that we do it differently. I think a lot of us are having that conversation now and trying to think more intentionally about our lives going forward after this. So I appreciate you kind of continuing to nudge us in that way, Dave. Also another thing I wanted to just check in with you about as a person who has just been really drawn to particular Native spiritual practices. What should white people consider if as they, like, say, adopt Native spiritual and cultural practices that are not really part of our root tradition?
Right. That's a good question, and I would frame it a little bit different. What do we as non-natives take a look at? Because I think that this can go in many ways. Though I will say that I believe white folks are at the leading edge of their appropriation of lots of stuff, including that type of thing. A spiritual practice to me is something that, again, is going to connect you to the depth of creation and creator, and that the first place to explore is what's within our own tradition. And I think that's what gets left out a lot. And so a lot of times folks will see something that an indigenous person is doing and going, well, why don't I try that? And not recognize what is out of their very own tradition that may be very, very similar. Mm-hmm. And so the thing is it's kind of like, to me, it's kind of like using sage. Smudging with sage, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense if there's not sage in your backyard. What is literally in your backyard or your front yard that ties you to the land?
Hey, so in wrapping up, I've been asking each person I talk to, do you have a prayer, a poem, a scripture, a practice, whatever, that's just grounding you in these particularly unsettling times?
Yeah, yeah. I would say there's this one. There's a piece out of the Hebrew text that talks about my ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and who went down to Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and they goes on to talk about, we became big, and we were a lot of folks, and God took us out of enslavement with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand, and gave us this place, ultimately getting to this place and this land flowing with milk and honey. And for me, in this day and time, I stick with that, because for me, there's the Deuteronomist priest who's talking at this time and turning to his people and saying, in this day of Solomon, this is as good as it gets. Life is really, really good. And yet, you're having problems. You Israelites, you're having problems looking around you, and not saying that. You've turned around and enslaved folks yourself. And you've got them in your vineyards, and you've got them in your houses, and you think this is a good thing. And you've forgotten what it means to be the Aramean. And for this day and time, I think that for me, it has a lot to say. But when I look, not only what's going on here, but when I look at my kin who are here, who have had to cross and migrate across borders, and how that plays out economically, that's what drives me. So that's not it. So I'm just saying that's not my scripture of comfort. That's my scripture of driving me to push for justice that I may not recognize.
So this is the guy that you were so helpful to me, Dave, at that anti-racism training. And so I just want to thank you for the gifts you bring to that process, and for continuing to hold that in front of yourself and all the rest of us. To people of Urban Sanctuary, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
All right.